A few weeks ago, I was over at Slack,
Yes.
and I was with Bert Richter, a Nobel Prize winner, and a man who had run Slack for several years. And we were chatting, and he brought to my attention that you chaired an important study that was given to the governor to help the governor and the various departments in the state plan their energy strategy as well as their strategy for reducing carbon emissions. And he said to me, nobody seems to remember that study. Now, you were the architect of that study. What do you say about his statement that hardly anyone remembers that study? It's been 5 years now. You released it in June of 2011. What do you say about that?
Well, I think people do remember the study and are still listening to it, and I'm still asked to come and talk about it all over the country. In December, I was at Harvard at the JFK school talking about the study, and it was just as relevant to them today as it was to us when we wrote it. In terms of influence on policy in California, I think we could have, I wish we had had a bit more influence, but perhaps because the study was a very technical study and we didn't make policy recommendations based on that study, that would have been the next step, would be to try to understand what it implies about policy and be specific about it. And that might have helped us.
Would I be correct? The study came about in part because in 2005, Arnold Schwarzenegger signed a bill called Assembly Bill AB 32.
Well, it's not AB 32, but yes, he signed an executive order.
And that executive order put California on a pathway to not only be able to provide the state the energy it needs, but also to be a leader in reducing carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions. Is that right?
Correct. I mean, his executive order was the first of its kind, saying California would reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, not produce so much renewable energy or not produce this many batteries, but reduce emissions by 80% below 1990 levels, and we would do that by 2050. As a very far-sighted executive order, which Governor Brown left in place when he came in. And Governor Brown has begun to look now at what are the interim steps to get to that goal.
And you would agree that the Brown administration have put in place several strategies for being able to meet those goals. Is that correct?
I think the strategies that the Brown administration has put in place are working towards those goals. I don't know that they're going to be sufficient to reach those goals. They're very aggressive, very, very aggressive goals.
When I took a look at the summary of this study, if I remember correctly, I saw 4 different strategies. Could you?
Yes. So we spent about 2 years doing this study, and I have to say the first year was really about developing what we thought were the important key strategies. And the first strategy was to reduce the demand for energy through efficiency measures. And everybody kind of feels that that's an important step. The second measure was to completely decarbonize electricity. Taking carbon out of electricity production is a very key strategy.
Could you give us one example of that?
So, for example, if you produce energy the way we largely produce it today, using a lot of fossil fuel to burn and produce electricity in a thermal power, what we call a thermal power plant, that produces carbon dioxide. There are a number of ways we could produce electricity without doing that, but I don't want to oversimplify it. It's actually a complicated problem because it's not just producing the electrons, but producing them when we need them. But we can use renewable energy to do that. We can use nuclear power to do that. And if we want to use fossil fuel, we can take that fossil fuel, the emissions from that, and sequester them, put them underground. So that's the second, and probably the single most important strategy is decarbonizing electricity. Then if we've managed to decarbonize electricity, then we can take a lot of the things we usually do with fuel, like burn fuel in our cars or burn fuel to make heat, and we can electrify them instead, because then the electricity isn't producing emissions. If you go down the street and you see an electric bus and it says it produces no emissions, that's not really true if the electricity it's using came from a thermal power plant that's producing emissions. So we have to couple those things. Yes. And the last thing is that we still need some fuel, because there's some things that just can't be electrified easily. And then we have to find ways to have fuel that doesn't emit carbon dioxide. And that is the hardest technical problem.
So electrification, isn't that like creating a electric car?
Yes, creating electric car, bus, trains, heat, using electric stoves or electric dryers instead of gas dryers or gas stoves. There's, basically it's the most important area is electrification of transportation. That will be the biggest hit.
Be the biggest.
The biggest hit, yeah.
Okay, I want to paraphrase, and I'm probably not going to get this correct. One of the strategies is renewable energy.
Right.
Another one is energy efficiency.
Right.
Another one is electrification. And what's the fourth?
We have to use fuel for certain things. You can't electrify them. So there's airplanes, can't really run on electricity, right? And for a good example, another one might be very high quality heat that you need in an industrial process. You need a very high heat, can't achieve with an electrical resistance. Those needs, those are somewhat irreducible. Some of them may eventually be reduced, but right now they're irreducible. You still need that fuel. And if we keep burning oil and gas, then for those fuel uses, then we're going to still have emissions. But if we, for example, just to give an example that isn't usually used, but is a good one, if we sucked carbon dioxide out of the air, took it away from the atmosphere, and put it in an oil reservoir and produced oil in that reservoir, when we burn that oil, it would be carbon neutral if we put enough carbon dioxide in there. So that would be a fuel that doesn't contribute to greenhouse gases.
Okay, so when your study came out 5 years ago, how was it received?
I think it was very well received. Everyone seemed very interested in it, and I think it did highlight for the state, for example, the need for carbon capture and storage. I think the state is moving slowly in the direction of trying to accommodate that technology.
Yeah, I'll come back to that point. But when I first looked at this report that Richter asked me to look at, I, not specialized in this area, envisioned the state had a strategy and was moving forward. And then along comes your study. And it's, in a way, at first, difficult to appreciate what your study does when one does not have a clear understanding of the state's strategy. Would you agree?
I'm not sure I understand what you're saying.
All right. Well, Schwarzenegger gave some goals, some objectives, and folks in Sacramento worked at putting together plans and strategies to attain those goals, right? And I think for most people, it's not clear in our heads what strategies they put in place, okay? Maybe to you. And then you come along with your study, right? What is the number one or number two contributions your study made to that? Does it include this? Your study provided deep, deep thinking to help the people in Sacramento think more clearly about it, or did you come up with any new strategies? And I think you did. I heard a little bit of the carbon capture a few minutes ago. Have I articulated a question enough for you?
Well, I mean, I think that the state was very involved in developing strategies for AB 32, remember, which is a 2020 goal of going back to 1990 emissions by 2020. And so there were a whole raft of regulations that were developed and to try to do that. There were limits on long-term power purchases in electricity, so that you were only allowed to make a long-term power purchase agreement if that power was below a certain emission rate. And there was a cap and trade program that was instituted. There was a low carbon fuel standard that was instituted. So all of these things were really aimed at 2030. I think what the governor's done now, and especially in his speech last year, is try to understand whether or not we're headed toward the 2050 goal. And in fact, we're not right now. I think the state has, I've looked at the data, and there are some people in the California Air Resources Board who manage this for the state who disagree with the data that I've seen. So I can't be absolutely sure my data is correct. But the data I've seen is that we added something like 17 gigawatts of solar power in the last 10 or 12 years, which is a huge amount. And by itself doesn't contribute emissions. But at the same time, we've added 30,000 gigawatts, 30,000 megawatts of gas-fired generation. And we've lost the nuclear power plant, the Songs plant in LA, which lost 2,000 megawatts of carbon-free energy. And we had a terrible drought, which took about a third of our hydropower away, which was also carbon-free. So if you look at the emissions track record of the state, it dips dramatically during the recession because we cut back on energy use, but it's all the way just about back to where it was before the recession. So we're really in a situation where we're not tracking a path that will get us to 80% below, and that's making the bend in that curve hasn't happened yet. And in order to do that, we're going to have some big tools like nuclear power, big tools like carbon capture and storage, really looking at land use planning and eliminating as much as we can the use of fuel through change in transportation methods. Those are the big things that we have to do.